computer. Okay, so you've now been warned, and let's get started. So this is a novel 5-phase model for understanding the nature of misophonia and providing treatment. I am Tom Dozier. I'm making the presentation. This model was developed by Nate Mitchell and I, and it is in review. A journal article is in review to publish in this model. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to talk about the other models of misophonia that exist very briefly, and then talk a lot about the Mitchell-Dozier model of misophonia. So here's the Yastreboff neurophysiological model, published it early on, 2002. And this is really a derivation of his model for tinnitus. And this is what parts of the brain connect together. And the real concern I have with this is this sensory process is being affected by the autonomic nervous system with the limbic and the other cortical areas. And I think that this is the driver. The autonomic nervous system is really the driver of your misophonia. Sukhbinder Kumar has published several, or at least I think at least three papers on misophonia and the brain structures that are involved. Basically, he's found that, or that group found that misophonia emotions are a learned emotional reflex. I won't say it in the complicated way that he does, but misophonia is a learned emotional reflex. It's not a defect, or it's not a genetic kind of condition. It looks like it's a learned defect. Okay, here's the factors of the brain that are involved. And for people who have misophonia, they hear a misophonia trigger and have this very strong boost to their emotions, emotional activity. And people who do not have misophonia actually have a suppression response to hold down their reaction. Then he's also looked at the orofacial mirroring neurons and shows that there's this kind of the monkey see, monkey do neurons. And he sees that these are firing, trying to make you mirror the actions that you hear. We know that mimicking is very common in misophonia. And so he says it's kind of a hyper mirroring of these orofacial actions. And so again, here he's showing that the mirroring is much higher in people with misophonia than without misophonia. Cohen has a really nice model. He calls it a psychological model, where he says that people are kind of predispositioned. They kind of have this negative emotional slant to them. The sound is made. There's some judgment about the sound not being appropriate. And then you get this initial negative reaction, which is anger and increased awareness. And then this builds through classical conditioning, and avoidance develops. And I think there's a lot of merit to this. I think this is probably a very, very accurate model of what's happening from this viewpoint. And then Dozier's behavioral model, what I saw was that people were having a physical reaction to triggers. And that because of this physical reaction, which I also saw working with people, that it was distinctly separated from the emotional reaction. And so in that situation, let's see, I heard a sound by someone. I'm trying to, please mute yourself if I have to figure out how to bring this up. But everybody should be muted. Okay, and let me get back to this. Okay, so this physical reflex then triggers the emotions and the distress and the acting out. And so I'll talk about this. This is actually incorporated within the Mitchell-Dozier model. And then here's another, this similar model, with this physical reflex is used by the was recognized by Chris Pearson as he developed secret repatterning therapy for misophonia. This is being provided by about 8 therapists worldwide. And there's been over 3,000 people who've received treatment using this model that recognizes that there's this physical reflex. I call it the initial physical reflex. And I've worked with over 500 people personally. So the Mitchell-Dozier model incorporates the Dozier model, but it adds on some things that are obvious and some things that are not so obvious. So, we get a kind of a one-for-one connection here vertically. But Dr. Mitchell added in this factor that we have anticipatory anxiety and avoidance. And there's a lot of dysfunction to your life in the avoidance, and the anticipatory anxiety typically makes it worse. We have the trigger and the reflex. It was in the Dozier model. And then to this emotional response, we add the thoughts, that there are thoughts just pushed into your brain and urges. And EDB stands for emotion-driven behavior, that you just feel like you must do something. It's not actually a reflex, but it feels like a reflex. And then the coping responses, there's both what I saw as the overt behavior of taking action to make the trigger stop, but there's also a mental review that goes on, which can be very critical to treatment. And then the environmental response and consequences that develop, and I'll talk about that. So anticipatory anxiety and avoidance, that actually is not, once you develop misophonia, that's where it starts. As you go into your school classroom or your workplace, or you leave the sanctity of your bedroom, you start to have this anxiety about the trigger. The anxiety increases your misophonia severity. There are cases where, especially in children, where they will scan and track maybe a particular person to make sure that they're not going to make a trigger, or that they can see if they do make a trigger. And this tracking, or constantly watching a parent, asking for reassurance, maybe even challenging, do you have anything in your mouth? No, I think you do. Yes, you have gum in your mouth. And that's the sort of thing that challenging those responses, this really disrupts the family a lot, and it causes new triggers. Because you're actually watching that, they're watching that person. So if they're worried that they're going to make a mouth sound, but they keep adjusting their glasses, then that can actually become a trigger. I worked with this one family, and this one young lady from maybe age 10 to 13 or so, and she was doing quite well, but she was still tracking her mother. And her mother was the only triggers. And when we had a clear expectation to not track mother, to pay attention to anything but mother, her misophonia went way down. And as far as I know, the last I heard, it was not significant. Many people will brace themselves for a trigger. You're worried about it. It might happen. You're gonna almost physically tense up and get ready to take the blow. And that actually makes your misophonia triggers stronger. And so I found that good misophonia management, that if you have the ability to be safe, then you don't have to be afraid that you're going to get zapped or tortured by triggers. So the next phase, this is really key, and this is something that you do not recognize in you, the vast majority of you, is that there's the trigger, and then there is what I call the initial physical reflex. And this is typically it's a muscle response, but it's virtually unknown by the misophonia sufferers. It's often confused with phase 3, with the distress that comes with the trigger. I'm going to use a metaphor of an avalanche, so that if you think about an avalanche, you think about all the crashing down of the snow and everything. and I didn't messed up my other recording. So comes crashing down the hill, and you notice the turmoil, you notice all the power, and I think it's interesting that as it comes down here, it actually washes over other people who are there, which is something that misophonia does. And then it leaves this dust in the air that eventually clears, but just because the avalanche is over, the dust storm is still there, the snow. And just because your trigger is over, you still have that some response, residual response there. So where did that avalanche start, right? It started as a slip, a small slip of the snow, and got bigger. And then we have all the power and everything we think of as an avalanche. That's a lot like misophonia. We don't know really where misophonia triggers start. At least we don't experience it that way. We experience the turmoil of the trigger. Okay, so with misophonia, we focus on the all of the things that happen after the initial event. Now, where is this going on neurologically? Well, in your brain, eyeballs over here, right? You have your thinking brain, your cerebrum up top. You have your emotional brain, your limbic system in the middle. And you have your autonomic nervous system down at the bottom. This is sometimes called your reptilian brain. It's your brain stem. I like to call it your lizard brain. It just reacts. A chameleon lizard crawls up on a rock and turns brown, crawls over on a leaf and turns green, has no idea what brown or green is. It's just a reaction. So your lizard brain learns reflexes. So beware, misophonia is contagious. It's contagious, almost like cold is contagious. And your lizard brain is like Roz in Monsters, Inc. Your lizard brain is watching you. Your lizard brain says, I'm watching you, always watching. And that lizard brain of yours is watching you to see what you do. And so to develop a reflex, the lizard brain notices a stimulus, and you have some negative thought, that's not appropriate. Remember, this goes back to like the Cohen model saying, oh, they shouldn't be doing that. And with that negative thought, that's unfair, it's not right, why won't they, it's going to go on forever. Then you have an unconscious muscle tensing. And if you do that 10 times, you now have a reflex, so that when you hear the trigger, your muscles twinge and it zaps you. Now, this was shown, really good research here by Donahoe in Vegas, 2004. And they looked at, if you think of Pavlovian conditioning, the traditional view is that Pavlov would ring a bell and give the dogs the meat. Ring a bell, give them meat. Ring a bell, give them meat. Ring a bell, no meat. Dog still salivates. And they would say that the bell and the meat become associated or connected so that the bell acts like the meat. Well, that's a good theory, but there's no neurological measures to show that. So what Donahoe in Vegas did is they had a delayed reflex where they could test it. And their conclusion was the critical temporal relation is between the conditioned stimulus, meaning the bell, and the unconditioned response, meaning salivation, not between the meat and the bell and the meat. So the conditioned stimulus connects with the response, and they become associated within the brain. Essentially, your lizard brain is trying to do what it sees you doing. So it watches you, and in misophonia, I don't find any equivalent for the meat in the misophonia response chain situations. So it takes a repeating stimulus and then a consistent unconscious physical action, tensing your shoulders, clenching your hands, and that stimulus, which is then going to be the trigger, becomes your conditioned stimulus, and the physical action becomes your conditioned response, or as I call it, your initial physical reflex. that stimulus can be any repeating stimulus. It's usually, auditory. We think of misophonia as the sound of chewing fills you with rage, something like that. But in a survey I did, about 1% of the people had a first trigger, which was an action. Either somebody bobbing their leg, or one person had a friend who would kind of use their thumb and pick at their cuticle. And that was her first, no sign, no sound, it was silent, became their first trigger. But the conditioned stimulus or trigger can be any repeating stimulus. And as long as you get some unconscious physical action, usually these are muscle actions, not always, but it's something that goes along with that thought. So you have your stimulus, your repeating stimulus, and you have some, I would call it an unconscious response. It's something you do. So if you're irritated, you may clench your fist or clench your jaw. If you're anxiety, you may tighten your shoulders, or you may hold your breath. One person remembers developing their first trigger. This individual had anxiety, shared a room with his brother. His brother had allergies, so he could hear his brother breathing. And he went to bed, he couldn't go to sleep, he was hearing his brother. After maybe 20, 30 minutes, he got fed up with it, went to the couch and went to sleep. But after that one night, every time he heard his brother breathe, for the next 30 years, it triggered him. I know two cases local here, one is definitely local, of mockingbird triggers. One person had mockingbirds build a nest outside his bedroom window. That sounds really cute, baby birds outside your window, except the male mockingbird chirps 24 hours a day sometimes. And he developed goosebumps response on his arms. Carla's mother, she was concerned that her daughter would develop a trigger of a clicking of the teeth of one of her brothers. Mother kept trying to get the boy to stop doing this. Carla didn't develop a trigger to that, but mother did. And then at the dinner table, mother was concerned that she could hear her father's chewing and was concerned that that would develop a trigger. And the daughter didn't develop a trigger to father. It was only to her brother, but mother developed a trigger to father chewing. Unconscious responses. One girl standing up and extended her arms, and that was her physical reflex. Another person who was straining to breathe, and she was holding her breath and tensing her face. They'll have a person who was developed misophonia in the Afghan conflict. The Marine, marching along, gets back, sitting in his barrack with a person beside him eating, and he clenches his shoulder, his right arm, and turns his head. Whether the trigger is on the right or the left, it's the right arm that clenches and the head turns to the right. Conditioned reflexes are very common in this world that we live in. Dr. Lipoff was a trauma center surgeon, and that was his first job. And as a trauma center surgeon, he got a pager, old school, right? And so with the pager, when the hospital needs you, and a trauma center is always gruesome, the pager goes brr or beep, beep, beep. And the doctor calls in and says, okay, I can be there in 3 minutes or 5 minutes. Off they go. But Dr. Lipoff would kind of go, oh, what am I going to have to deal with? And kind of dreading how ugly it might be. And after about a month, it was, brr, oh, what's it going to be this time? And I said, Gene, how long did that shoulder flinch persist? He says, until I got a different job and got rid of my pager. Every time the pager went off, my shoulders went up. Okay, so this is common, and there's no research on this. So if there's anybody out there who wants to do a master's research study on learned reflexes, this is something that is completely undocumented in the psychological or physiological world. Did a brief survey. 6 out of the 10 said they had a physical response to their pager. Have a friend who was a professional who received stressful phone calls, and his chest muscles would tighten. Another one that was sensation on the leg. Anyway, this is it's everywhere, but it's not documented. Now, misophonia, this is from a study we did that was published. Age of onset, notice we get this, mostly in the late childhood, preteen time, but we had people out here in their 20s, 30s, and 40s developing misophonia. So this is not something that has to occur at a specific time. It's something that can occur and develop at any time in your life. And about 50, I don't remember exact percentage, but it looks like there's about 10% of the 10 to 15% of the people develop misophonia after 19 or older. Now, we saw this physical reflex, and I believe it's been in every presentation that I've made since 2014. And it is still not understood or universally accepted. And so Kate Morrison and I think it was around 2015, we started trying to put together this study. Took us several years over a year to get it published. But we had people hear tiny bits of triggers, and we wanted them to hear a little bit of a crunch or a little bit of a sniff, and then say, what did that trigger you? Not really. Well, what do you feel physically? And they go, well, I felt something in my back, or felt my shoulders. And, everybody had some kind of a physical sensation to at least some of their triggers, but some of them were like nausea or a flash of warmth or sexual sensation. So they weren't all muscle. One person had a numb sensation, and I've had another person since then. And so anyway, these arrows show the locations so that one person might clench their jaw, another person curls their toes. And a person may have, for, let's say, eating triggers, they may clench their fist. And then for breathing or sniffing, their calves may tighten up. So you can have different initial physical reflexes for different types of triggers, different classes of triggers. But if you have a fist clench for auditory chewing triggers, then you'll have a fist clench for seeing somebody chewing, because that's been paired with the sound, and it'll have the same initial physical reflex. So, have you ever been shocked with electricity? If you've ever been shocked with electricity, then you felt something, but you can't detect electricity with your 5 senses. So touch, taste, sight, smell, hearing do not detect electricity, but what you're detecting is the muscle tightening, and it's an internal signal. So when you are triggered, you're essentially being tasered by your lizard brain. It's not the sound that's hurting you, it's your lizard brain. So I got this big rubber band here. I'm going to do my imitation of misophonia. I'm going to say slurp. Okay, so slurp, slurp. That's enough. I don't think I'm going to do it a third time. Okay, so you're getting zapped. Now, I had a young lady that helped me understand this and to understand the separation of the physical reflex and the emotional response. So, by the way, this was Carla, which I mentioned before. And so this was an experimental treatment. We had Carla laid out on a massage table here with her mom rubbing her back, and I was going to play small snippets of the trigger of her brother chewing, tiny bits. And I asked Carla before we started, I said, do you have a physical response to the trigger? She says, no, I just feel rage. And she was absolutely sure of that. And so we started doing this process of mom relaxing her, and I played little bits of the trigger, and I came up in terms of volume and length until it started to trigger her, and we saw this. Every time she heard a trigger. And afterwards, I asked Carla, I said, did you feel anything when you heard your brother, you heard the trigger? And she goes, yeah, I felt my arms and my legs. We hadn't noticed the legs. I said, well, what emotions did you have? She says, oh, none. Because it was so small, the physical reaction was happening, but it wasn't triggering the follow-on emotional reaction. Now, I'm going to show you a video here of my granddaughter, Katie. And Katie was nice enough to help me and had a really strong physical response. And so you're going to hear 2 sniffs and see her response. And so beware if you need to protect yourself. Okay, so here we go. Wow. Now, that's a very strong initial physical reflex. Some people have very weak initial physical reflexes, but that's an example, again, of a very strong one. So this is, most people do not recognize their initial physical reflex. When I have a new patient come in, many of them will say, I've been looking for my reflex. I haven't been able to figure it out. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that, whatever. And by the time we finish our first education and assessment meeting, they're going, yep, I have an initial physical reflex. I get it. Because again, the emotional response is so overwhelming that you don't really even notice that the physical response comes first. So I talked about Dr. Lipoff. I've given these stories already. Pam, my wife, developed misophonia. I don't remember, maybe 6 years ago now. And she came in and says, Tom, you've got to do something about the chickens. They're driving me crazy. And she's got these pet chickens, and her computer desk faces the window, and she looks out over the beautiful yard, and there's a little jump where there's no grass. It's got her pretty stuff, but chickens devastate everything. But the chickens will jump up on a bar and peck at the window. And I said, well, what are they doing? She goes, they're squawking. I said, Pam, they're chickens. Said, what the heck? And she goes, no. Buffy starts squawking, and Susie's squawking, and Roxy's squawking, and they're all squawking at the same time, and I can't stand it. Well, we actually figured out the concern here was that Pam was worried that the neighbors would hear the loud chickens and be bothered by them, and she didn't want that to happen. And she's like, they're squawking. Oh, and she'd hold her breath. Oh, no. And she'd hold her breath. So because it was a breath, when her lizard brain heard the chicken squawking, she stopped breathing. And so all she had to do is breathe. So she just started breathing in and out. When the chickens were squawking, keep breathing. And the 2-second rule for the lizard brain is that whatever your lizard brain sees you doing in the first 2 seconds after a trigger is what it will do automatically for you. So when her lizard brain noticed chicken squawking, breathing stops, chicken squawking, breathing stops, you do that 5 or 10 times, lizard brain goes, oh, I can do that for you. And now it's chicken squawking, and Pam's getting this tasering in her chest. And so, but by breathing steadily, and when the chickens were squawking, then the lizard brain will go, stop, no, it keeps going, stop, no, it keeps going. And the lizard brain is neurotic and insecure, has zero initiative. It just wants to follow and do what it sees you doing. So as long as Pam kept breathing, lizard brain learned that it went away. So beware, misophonia is contagious. I told you about Carla's mom. Now, we saw this first study, and we had self-report, which is notoriously has problematic. And so we said, let's do another pilot study where we can watch the people and measure it with electromyography. And so here is a trace where we had the timing pulse, nothing happening here, triggers being played, and then about 200 milliseconds after the trigger starts, we see a flinch in her deltoid muscle and flinches in her calf muscles. And this person was very precise in her physical reflexes, but for some triggers, it might have been just her calves, and in other triggers, it might be paraspinals, deltoids, and calves. But this 200 milliseconds was pretty consistent with her and another person. And we were able to see an immediate motion in all the people, but some we don't know where it was coming from, so we couldn't measure it electrically. But it looked like it happened instantly. So for auditory trigger, there's a 200 millisecond delay. Now that is really short. So you hear that trigger, and in 200 milliseconds, your muscles are firing, and maybe in another 50 or 100 milliseconds, your head is exploding with all the emotions, and you don't notice that initial reflex. And for visual triggers, it took a little bit longer to cause that reflex to occur. Okay, so let's go back to this model. We've covered this initial reflex here and the trigger, and now we're going to go into the intense emotions, physiological distress, thoughts, urges, and emotion-driven behavior. Now, this phase here, again, I don't have specific data on it, but it happens very quickly after the reflex. So the physiological distress here may actually include tensing of the muscles here as part of the way you just respond to distress. And that's what makes it so hard and so confusing to recognize the initial physical reflex. But if we could just get rid of this initial physical reflex, we would break the chain, right? It wouldn't trigger the emotions. But the problem is this is caused by normal neurology. It's not, you don't have some defect in your upper brain telling you these sounds are going to hurt you, or some chemical imbalance, or neurons that are randomly firing at the wrong time, or some crossing of the neurons so that auditory neurons cross over to emotional neurons. It's not a defect. And so we can't just give you a pill or cut it out. But we know how to bring this reflex down. And as the reflex comes down, the emotions, the distress, the coping, the anticipatory anxiety, everything comes down as we bring down this initial physical reflex. So the treatment that we do works on all of the phases, but it does it by bringing down the initial physical reflex. And it doesn't work for everyone, but it works for a very high percentage of people. Occasionally there's someone that their reflex goes down and they still have the emotions. And there's some people who have a reflex that we can't work with, like the man who felt numb sensation on his face is not something that we can work on this way. Okay, so Pavlovian conditioning and that misophonia reflex, remember the 2-second rule. After a stimulus, there's a 2-second window of learning where your lizard brain is watching, and whatever it sees you doing after the trigger, after it zaps you, then if it sees you tighten that muscle a little bit yourself, it goes, oh, doing the right thing, which is what naturally happens. If it goes trigger, boom, really getting to you, then the lizard brain goes, oh, I need to do it harder and harder and harder. And that's part of why it gets worse and worse and worse. But if you relax that muscle before the trigger, it's good and relaxed, and it's trigger, boom, relax, that tells your lizard brain it predicted incorrectly, and it needs to not do that. So that will cause it to come down. Now, you don't typically have the ability to relax your muscles on demand. And so progressive muscle relaxation is a technique that triggers neurological growth and makes new connections in your brain to be able to relax on demand. So try to relax even if you haven't developed the skill, because doing a poor job of relaxing is better than doing a good job of tensing up. There's a free app, Misophonia Muscle Relaxation Training. Training is only on the Android label. Here it is. And what happens is that it allows the dendrites to grow and grow new connections. And one neuron in your brain is connected to maybe 1,000 other neurons. So it grows all of these great connections in the brain that let you relax on demand. So here's a person who used this technique. She was disabled by misophonia, had a very strong jaw reflex. She did a lot of muscle relaxation training, had some good experiences, fortunate experiences where she was able to relax when there were some triggers. And it just came down. Great response. This is much better than you would expect because she had a really good event in this first week with real triggers and relaxing. Here's another more typical kind of a case where this person couldn't talk to her parents, couldn't eat with her parents. She started relaxing, started having short conversations with her parents, and went down and down and down. Now, here, this is 7 months later. She said her only trigger was at work where she worked in a feed store and she might be working, checking out a customer, and this man would come in whistling and it would trigger her. She'd turn back, just relax and turn back to the person she was working with. The trigger would die away and she would be unaware of it. So that was her only trigger left. So it doesn't work for everyone, but this is a major component, and we've seen enough separation between the reflex and the emotions to know that these are distinct and in this order. Okay, so now phase 3, the intense emotions, physiological distress, thoughts, urges, and emotion-driven behavior. Again, this is coming from the work that Kumar did. The emotions are coming out of your cerebrum. That's what's driving it. And there's the anterior insula, which gets both the sound or the sight and the physical sensation of the reflex, relays out to the VMPFC, which goes, oh yeah, I recognize that. That's anger, okay. And then it fires down into the amygdala and the hippocampus, and you get the emotional explosion. So the way the emotions develop, we believe, is twofold. One is, in many people, the reflex is intrusive. If you thought about having fingernails on a chalkboard, if you're one of the 95% or so people who really respond to that sound, people say, oh, stop, I hate that sound. But they should be saying, oh, stop, I hate shivering. And if somebody kept making that sound, you'd be, and you would get both the emotions from the reflex and from the conflict and emotional experiences that go along with that. And these emotions are extremely intense, right? Very distressing. You may have experienced hating someone that you love dearly. That's really weird. Or being super mad at somebody who's really nice to you and that you love completely. Well, there's a physical component of this, that if somebody comes up behind you and pops you in the head, you're going to have a negative emotional response. And so it's called pain-induced aggression. And they did this experiment with these lab rats, and they found that if they would shock the rat, zap them, and they were facing forward, it'd be like, and they'd sit there. But if one was facing the other, it'd be zap, attack. Or if they both were looking at each other, zap, attack. What are we doing? I don't know. And they'd stop. They'd only go after each other for about 1 second. And then they would stop. So because you're a mammal, if you get zapped, even though you're being zapped by your lizard brain, that creates the negative emotions. And then again, all of the things that go along with asking people to stop, and they're telling you you're faking it, and all the other social interaction that goes on. So physiological distress, you feel the initial physical reflex. You're going to have your anger responses, which includes increased heart rate, sweating, muscle tension. You may have specific muscles. One man said, oh yeah, I clenched my fist, I clenched my jaw. Well, we worked through this, and the jaw was his initial physical reflex, and the fist and the jaw was his emotional anger. You get hormones being released in your body. You get this trigger of this fight, flight, or freeze response. So you have, I call it often the misophonia yucky response. It just feels horrible. Now, I have to tell you, if you disagree with me, you can tell me. I have never been triggered. So when you're triggered, I don't know what you experience, okay? But I know it's bad. and I believe you. Then you get these automatic thoughts. It's unfair. They're so inconsiderate. They're rude, gross. And I asked some people on Facebook, what are some of the thoughts you have that just pop into your head? He's doing it on purpose to hurt me. I can hear his, it's so gross. I hope they choke. They deserve to die. And these are usually very, very out of character, which is in and of itself distressing, because most of you are kind, nice people who don't want to be mad at people, don't want to be angry, yet you're having these really strong emotions and often physical urges. There was a lady on a Southwest flight going from Chicago to Manchester, New Hampshire. And I think this is 2015, and the man beside her, who was 68 years old, went to sleep, started snoring. She jostled him and wake him up, and she couldn't wake him up. She took her ballpoint pen and she stabbed him in the arm. And they took it back to the gate and took her off the plane and put her on a later flight. So very strong. The urges, the emotion-driven behavior. So these feelings you have to do things are really action tendencies. They're not truly a reflex. Like the man that had the reflex to the Marine, when he heard a person chewing in front of him, on his left or his right, his head went to the right and his shoulder clenched. That's a true reflex. But if you're orienting to find where it is, or you're trying to, what can I do to stop it? That's the emotion-driven behavior, and you have a tendency to either avoid or approach and take action on the anger. So even though these seem like reflexes, they're not. They can be changed, okay? Although it is not, I'm not saying this simple, but the easiest way to change them is to bring down the severity of the zap, and then it's much easier to work on the other behaviors. Okay, coping responses. Now, I always thought of this as overt behavior, outward behavior, things that you could see. Dr. Mitchell realized from talking with people that there was a lot of mental review where people would actually think about the sound and the reason and the unfairness of it and mull over it. And this phase can go on for more than 24 hours for some people, right? This is, some people, they're triggered, the trigger stops, and in a minute they're gone, they're fine, everything's fine, carry on with life. Some people, this really lingers a lot. And so Dr. Mitchell has found that ripping yourself away from the mental review of the trigger, just forcing yourself to look at other things or count other things or do something different, really is an important part of basically giving the feedback to your brain that what just happened is not important. I mean, if you mull over something for a couple of minutes, then, hey, that's worthwhile. Your brain should remember that. So we really want to have people turn away, get rid of that view. I mentioned that. So this phase 4, the phase 3 reflexes that are going on when the trigger stops, they do continue for a while. But this phase 4 coping responses are non-reflexive, and they've been shaped by past interactions. So you get this, again, this internal behavior. You want to reduce that. Anger rumination is something that they show is that when you're angry, you keep mulling it over. Again, you want to break yourself away from these. And then the external behavior, aggressive behavior, verbally snapping, trying to escape, good management, right? It's going to happen, but you want to tone it down and use good management rather than being verbally or physically aggressive. And then try to pull your focus away from the trigger, redirecting your attention to another sensory input, not to a thought or to a poem or something, but to something you can fill your sensory neurons with, whether it's a visual thing that you're looking at all the little mini details on something, or I've got my little painted rock here that my wife made that I can look at and feel, or you're feeling how your thumb feels by rubbing your fingernail over your thumb over your fingernail, any of those things. And then the last one is environmental response. We know that consequences shape behavior. So this really feeds back to the coping responses, to the emotional driven behavior, and it feeds back to the anticipatory anxiety. So these results, you might have explosive behavior, and parents often try to respond. I'm not saying we shouldn't be thoughtful and helpful, but we often get into this battle and these conflicts that go back and forth. And sometimes the parent comes in blasting in on the child. Stop that, don't do that, that's so inconsiderate. Sometimes they become over accommodating. There could be a number of things that can happen. Good environmental changes is to, use earplugs, use noise, change the environment, move away. But you also get internal consequences developing. One of the things is by reviewing it and by the way the world responds around you, you can develop new beliefs that triggers are intolerable. Now, triggers are very unpleasant. And again, I have not had one. So you can say, Tom, you don't understand how bad it is. And you're right, I don't. But they don't cause bleeding. It's not going to kill you, even though it's horrible feeling. But sometimes we become very sensitive to the uncomfort of something, and we start calling it intolerable when it really is tolerable. And also we get a lot of blasts from parents often to kids, which cause shame and guilt emotions to develop because you're a bad person because you're saying and doing these things. Okay, so a couple of therapies here: relaxation and counterconditioning therapy. That's something that I provide by video chat. It's education on misophonia reflexes, including determining your initial physical reflex. Again, we almost always can convince a person with misophonia that this model is correct when we start using microscopic levels of triggers where you can feel it and not have the emotional explosion. But also understanding how these reflexes develop and decay. Relaxation training, which is a skill development generally done with progressive muscle relaxation training as needed. Counterconditioning, which is a way of experiencing real life triggers where they will reduce. Sometimes we have happy activities with tiny bits of triggers using the Misophonia Trigger Tamer app, or using good management so that there's a good background noise, so that 8-level trigger is now just a 3, and then you can relax and focus on other things and allow it to come down. Avoid prolonged misophonia distress. This is very important because the more you are in agony, misophonia agony, normal exposure to triggers, the worse, the stronger the physical reflexes become, the stronger the emotional responses become, the faster the processing area for the emotions in the brain becomes, with the myelination around the neurons. So you can superconducting neurons in your brain, and you pick up new triggers. So very, very bad. So we also have some additional skills that deal with handling, how to change things so that it starts to go down, and ongoing support. Treatment implications. This model can be a component of any treatment program. So Nate Mitchell is a psychologist, and he provides cognitive behavioral therapy, misophonia, CBT-M, and he will cover a broader area of other things that are causing difficulty for the person. I am a behaviorist. I call mine relaxation and counterconditioning therapy, RCT. Work on primarily the things that I've talked about here. So I don't work on PTSD at the same time, or specifically, on general anxiety disorder at the same time. But good management, reduce your anticipatory anxiety, because if you know you're going to be safe, you don't have to worry. If you know you have a good protection system, reduces that initial physical reflex of phase 2, modify your emotion-driven behavior as necessary, and work down that mental review that you have after triggers. You want to shift your attention, focus on other stimuli, and then remember, relax, relax, relax. And for many people, it's relax and slowly breathe. So, conclusion, we believe this is a comprehensive theory of misophonia as a conditioned or learned response disorder. Misophonia is a conditioned aversive response or reflex disorder. So I think CARD would be a better name, more appropriate for this condition than misophonia. So thank you very much. We have some time. Actually, I have a lot of time, but we have a good 10 minutes here, 8 minutes for questions. And I will try to look at some of these, and I might have my helper, Pam, is going to be helping me look at this. I will say that next week, let's do it again. Would like to present the other session that I did at Misophonia Convention, reducing your misophonia severity with progressive muscle relaxation training. And you can register that with the same link, and it will be the same time next Thursday. So I look forward to seeing you here again. So now, let's see if I can look at some of these questions. So there's a mention here of visual triggers, right? And remember, almost anytime you say, does anybody else have this trigger? The answer is going to be yes, because almost anything can become a trigger unless it's something really unique that only a family member does. So any questions about this model? Trying to go back up and see. So noise isolating headphones, see, one of the things you want to do is you want to bring down the intensity. If we go back and look at the model here, right? If this reflex is strong and the physical zap that you get and these emotions are very strong, it's like an 8 or a 9 or a 10, then you're not going to be able to really do anything other than just explode and react to it, or just hunker down and take the abuse. But if you add noise is one of the best, most common treatments for misophonia. And you can add, and I'm going to say there's 2 conditions. So you have basically, I'm going to do work condition. And in the I'm going to do work condition, you want to it's great to block the noise. Use noise canceling headphones with a noise app playing some background noise so that you don't even hear the triggers, and you can carry on and get your work done. Then there's the misophonia treatment. And by the way, that's also knowing that you have that ability to add the noise and block the triggers allows you to reduce your anticipatory anxiety and your avoidance, because you're going to go out. But if this happens, I'm going to put on my headphones with the noise, with the added noise behind it, and I'm going to be okay. And so that really can bring down your anticipation, anxiety. But then you have I'm going to work on my misophonia. Now, you have to have experience with a trigger to cause that reaction to go up or to go down. And so we know how to make it go up. That's just normal experience. But to make it go down, you want to remember the 2-second rule, that whatever your lizard brain sees you doing in the first 2 seconds after a trigger. So it's trigger a reflex, and then it's watching you. And if it sees you pulse that muscle, it goes, ah, I predicted correctly. Trigger, boom, boom again. And then you do it like, ah. And then it goes, okay, I'm doing the correct thing. But if you bring that trigger from an 8 down to a 3, you're focusing your attention on other things, other stimuli, and you're relaxing your body, then it's trigger, boom, and then you relax. Trigger, relax. Okay, so I have some questions here. Any advice on supporting family members with misophonia? That's a good question. I've just got to say, it can be hard. You really want to have a balance of help versus that family member controlling the world. Okay, it needs to be a mutually, at certain times you're gonna give way and make it where there's not going to be triggers, and at other times they're going to put on headphones or they're going to do something so that they're going to manage their triggers. So support for family members needs to be balanced. I'm going to go back to what I was saying about the 2-second rule. If you will relax in advance so that it's trigger, boom, relax, the lizard brain goes, I did the wrong thing. Trigger, relax, still wrong. Trigger, oh no, trigger, oh, nothing. Trigger, okay, that's the right thing. Trigger, and that reflex can go away in 20 to 30 minutes. Now it's going to come back. It's called spontaneous recovery, but it won't be as strong the next time. So that really can happen. Not common that you're going to be that good at relaxing, but it does happen. Okay, so I mentioned about supporting family members. Do you think there is a stronger relationship with misophonia and visual triggers than research is currently investigating? Now, I didn't even use the other M word there because I dislike that word, because I want to call it visual triggers, because auditory triggers, visual triggers, olfactory triggers, tactile triggers, these are all triggering the same brain structures where the emotions are coming from and the physical reflexes. So the problem is that it started as an auditory condition only, and when I review journal articles, I almost will insist that they mention in the discussion of misophonia that it includes auditory and visual triggers, but we only cover auditory triggers in this study. So yeah, that's a problem. So I need a professional to help me identify my physical response. Oh, do I? The answer is yeah, usually, right? Usually you do. How would you find that help in San Diego? I work by video chat. I don't, they're only people who are associated with the Misophonia Institute really fully buy into this model. Myself, Nate Mitchell, Chris Pearson have changed. That's another group of people, and some people that we've trained, so probably less than a dozen people, maybe less than 20, fully believe this model. But I see it every day with new people. So I work by video chat. So I don't mean to make a big plug about that. But if you go to misophoniatreatment.com, right, this website here, that's my work website, and you can find out information. There is a directory there also. Let's see. From Richard. Unceded land there. Sorry, I don't understand Richard's question. Richard, if you're there, you want to open up and ask your question. Is there a connection between OCD, blood pressure, and misophonia? They're different. But there might be that people who have a little bit of OCD are more anxious and feel things aren't right, and then they develop triggers to it. So that's possible, but we also show that there are many people with no other psychological conditions of any kind that develop misophonia. Okay, so can you perhaps give an example of a trigger and how one would relax to use this technique. Okay, so let's take the dinner table, and let's suppose that the reflex is in the shoulders. Okay, that your initial reflex is to clench your shoulders. So in that situation, you would add some background noise. You could use a noise app and earbuds. You could add a box fan to the room. You could turn on the exhaust fan. I typically would not use the exhaust fan. I would typically recommend using something more like a noise app on your phone, a phone. And a really good noise app is White Noise by T-M-S-O-F-T. It's T as in Tom, M as in Mary, soft as in software. And with it, you can have different kind of sounds, and you can get a whole list of sounds. And then you can use the noise to reduce your awareness and the severity of the trigger. So you take that trigger that's an 8 down to a 3. You've done muscle relaxation training, so you've developed the neurological connections of relaxing on demand, and then you focus on something. You focus on the food or your plate or the conversation, and you try to stay relaxed. So you need to bring that trigger from that 8 down to the 3 so that you can then relax and have it go away. Or aware of any voice altering apps for the listener with misophonia to avoid responding to triggers in a speaker's voice? I am not. There is if you're talking about like a child is only triggered by their mother's voice, you can get a voice changer. I've recommended that. Or you can use talk by, when I say a voice changer, you can talk by cell phone with the voice changer so that you're getting a different voice coming through. Okay, can you perhaps give another example of a trigger? I think I just did that one. Okay, maybe that came in again. So let's take another trigger. So let's take I'm trying to take a case. This was the lady that had the great response. She had a jaw reflex. Now, we're really good at relaxing our jaws because we use it so much. We're really good at relaxing our hands. But if you think of your hands, and you can, like, I can do this with my fingers, there's no way I could do that with my little toes, right? Because you've used your hands so much. So, but she had a jaw reflex. And so the children came out after she was doing a service activity for her elderly neighbor. Her and her mother were, they were pulling weeds from her flower garden. And so school comes out, as in kids are in school when they start this, and school lets out, kids come home, they're screeching and screaming, and that's the trigger for her. And it's like, ah! And this is a lady who would typically have, meltdowns in public, right? She could break down in public due to triggers. She was spending 95% of her time in isolation. She said, but the screeching is going on. It's like, no, on the severity scale. She said, but I really wanted to, do this service for this nice lady. So I just tried to relax. She said, as soon as I tried to relax, I noticed that my severity edged off of a 9 and started coming down. She said, I just kept my jaw relaxed and I kept working on the weeds. And this is interesting because weed pulling, if you've never done weed pulling, it's not grab and pluck, right? It's grab, wiggle, watch what you're doing, get the root out and all. So it's a very tactile activity that she's focusing on, relaxing, focusing on pulling weeds. She said, after 5 minutes, my response had come down to a 5. After 15 minutes, it was at maybe a 1 or a 2. And after 20 minutes, I was unaware of the kids shrieking. Now, that's her with a jaw trigger with extreme motivation to a jaw initial physical reflex. A more appropriate one might be that you have a partner that wiggles their legs, while you're watching TV. So you want to focus on the TV You want to position yourself so you're not seeing this wiggling out of the corner of your eye all the time. You may put more separation so that it's a smaller trigger and less triggering. That's often the case with triggers if you're further away and it's not as big in your face. And then maybe just occasionally look over and then go back to the TV. Look over, sample the trigger, go back to the TV. Or would be look over, close your eyes, go back to the TV, right? So you want to get small triggers. How fast can people recover? I gave some examples of people that recover quickly, but most people recover slowly. Most people, it's going to take them at least 3 months to 6 months to even 9 months of getting it coming down and doing the right thing. I had one young lady, 18 years old, her misophonia had come way down. She'd fine, Tom, I don't need your help anymore. And about a year later, she comes back and says, my misophonia is as horrible as it's ever been. I said, well, what did we do? What did you do a year ago to bring your misophonia down? And she said, I don't remember. So it's so easy to go back to your old ways. You really need to treat misophonia as a chronic condition that you're going to need to manage forever. Okay. Now you may be like my daughter, younger daughter, who says, Dad, I don't remember the last time I was triggered, right? But she said, but if I'm really stressed and tired, then I can get triggered. So that's an answer to that. Let's see if there's anything down here at the bottom of this list. So can you get therapy from me or a list of providers in our areas? Life is out of control by this. I'm sorry about that, Karen. Yeah, it does that. On misophoniatreatment.com, there is a treatment provider directory. And because I work by video chat, I show up in every country and in every state. But there are people in the different states and different places, but you want to make sure you find somebody who, you feel comfortable working with, who has a knowledge and a track record with misophonia. But yes, I provide treatment by video chat. We perhaps have another example of a trigger. We just did that. Your daughter has to withdraw from college classes because the instructor's speech patterns. Such an app would be great. Yes, it would. But if you have ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act accommodations, then you may be able to get a transcript of the class, right? So that your daughter could in fact continue. Also, please add to get your child a 504 for school accommodation. So getting a 504 plan, I cannot officially diagnose misophonia as a behaviorist. But when I work with someone that needs school accommodations, I write a letter that says, I'm working with so-and-so to provide treatment for misophonia. This is misophonia. This is what it is. This is how it qualifies for accommodations. And oh, by the way, when this person hears the triggers the sounds and the sights that trigger this person at school, and when they're triggered, they have a physical flinch of their muscles tightening. So I usually, in the first session, I always want to try to find that reflex if possible. And so it actually is a very believable request for accommodations. And I don't remember the last time it wasn't accepted. There are some places that have very formal rules that say you must have a diagnosis by a licensed clinician. But the ADA does not require a diagnosis, right? There are no conditions listed in the ADA document. It simply says it's a condition that causes a substantial impairment in one or more areas of your life. And misophonia definitely hits the area of concentrating. And so it it definitely qualifies. Like I say, I don't remember the last time my letter was not accepted. Do I take insurance? You know, unfortunately, insurance doesn't take me. There's two issues. First off, I'm in California, and in California, there is no licensing, state licensing for behavior analyst, which is what I am. I'm a board certified behavior analyst. So I'm not licensed, which that is a way insurance companies say, oh, we don't cover that. The second thing is that if they do, I'm out of network. And so the vast majority of times when somebody does go to the trouble of doing insurance, and I see the bills come in, the payment information comes in, it goes to out-of-pocket deductible. So generally, insurance is not covered. But send me an email and I'll tell you about my standard fee and my reduced fee. If my standard fee causes you to incur debt, that's the rule. If it causes you to incur debt, you receive a 50% reduction. And the validity, the way you certify for qualifying is you tell me it would cause you to incur debt. Okay. So a good comment there from someone about a son who can move away with you use earbuds. Okay. Oh, well, kudos to Paris, who was in the UK for suffering with this and sticking with this. Let's see, I'm going to jump down because I think the other ones there's comments here going on. So the voice changer app hasn't helped. Okay, was that okay, that was a direct message to me. Brown noise is good. The white's too harsh, yes, but with this noise app, you can do you know, Amazon jungle, you can do ocean waves, you can do rain on a tent, you can do babbling brooks, you can do all kinds of sounds, and you can do mixes of sounds. So I highly recommend a noise app that allows you to do mixes of sounds, that if you can have sounds that have the same frequency component as the triggers, then, and those are good sounds by definition, then when a trigger comes along, they're not as noticeable. Okay. Thank you. You're very welcome. You know, one of the things the person mentioned, an audiologist, and with an audiologist, you can get a hearing aid device that actually plays to whatever's on your phone, and with that device, then it's very there's no social stigma about hearing that because nobody knows you have it. Okay, so I'm gonna jump down to the end and see what we have at the end. I don't know if you have another question, post it now. You know, it really, I will say, if there's anybody here whose child is just barely starting to have misophonia and you're looking into it, go do something now. It is so much easier to work on when a person has only triggers with family members at home, only auditory triggers. It rarely, in my experience, do I get reports of it going away. It does happen sometimes. Can medicine help? There was a good presentation given on that at the Misophonia Association. If you have a very strong reflex, thank you, sister, then you can reduce that cortisol kick by taking a beta blocker. And so that has helped some people. If you have anxiety or if you have depression, then medication for those things can in fact help. Okay, I skipped someone. You've had it for 50 years, and I was made to feel crazy. Just listening to this presentation has my heart racing. Aren't I hardwired at this point since I started in my childhood? No, this is soft wiring. I've worked with people. I worked with a woman who was in her 73, 74, who even have some videos of Virginia on my YouTube channel, who was a great success case. I worked with a lady who had very unusual misophonia. She had triggers to dropping pans, triggers to pouring dog food into a tin bowl, even if she was doing it, trigger to a blender. And she got some recordings of triggers and using the Trigger Tamer app. And she had a breath altering reflex. So we found out what it was. It was a breath altering reflex. So she had poor eyesight, and she had been a religious person all her life, and she had an old hymn book, and she liked to sing. So here she is with her magnifying glass singing with her old hymn book. Now that takes concentration and focus to get on the right line and go down from one bar to the next. And she's singing as the Trigger Tamer is occasionally playing the triggers, and her trigger to pouring the dog food into the bowl went away. Now, many people would say, oh, a dog food into a tin pan, that's not going to be misophonia because that's not oral or nasal sounds. But because it was clearly a conditioned aversive reflex, right, that she was able to work on that and do it. So did I finish? So I think I finished the one about you've had it for 50 years, right? Yes, it can change. Sorry about skipping it. If anybody here has a little child, children that are less than 10, primarily I work with the parents, and then the parents do the play with the child with the small amounts of triggers. And sometimes with those children, just getting away from the conflict-oriented emotional burst of life that you get with some of these little kids, which is, by the way, is my primary career as a behavioral parenting coach, then the misophonia severity goes way down. It's no longer a problem. A beta blocker is something like propranolol, P-R-O-P-R-A-N-O-L-O-L, propranolol. I'll type it into the link here. Okay, propranolol, I spelled it right. Okay. So I'm picking up. So if you have a question and I haven't answered it, type now or forever hold your peace. How do you find your IPR? That's a very good question. You find your IPR, Talia, using a very small one-time event trigger. So I am going to stop sharing my screen for a moment here. And I'm going to, whoops, that's share screen. Stop share.